Excellent. Welcome back after our afternoon break. Right now, we are going to welcome Annie Noonan to come and talk with us about recruitment and retention. And given your long tenure in state government, would welcome you to just help folks who are sitting around the table or watching from home to know who you are and how you come to have a deep understanding of this issue.
Well, thank you very much.
And Annie, feel free to take off your mask.
I will. I am vaccinated.
The sound is pretty awful.
Okay.
So.
Well, great. Thank you very much. Thank you, committee members. Welcome. For some I know, others I'm meeting for the first time. My name is Annie Noonan. I currently work in state government. I am here today, not in that capacity. I'm here today in a very different capacity, reflecting my prior work history in and around state government. I was asked to, and I have copies of my testimony, which I'll turn in at the end. Thank you, senators. I was asked to speak today on behalf of the Vermont labor community, members of the VSEA and Vermont Troopers Association. I do believe my comments would also represent sentiments of many Vermont NE members. My perspective on the issue of retirement changes, recruitment and retention in state government is founded in my 30-year career at VSEA, 14 of those as executive director. In that role, I served as director, chief negotiator, head lobbyist for VSEA, which during those years included representing the members of the VIP who are now with VTA. I monitored and lobbied on the state employee retirement plan and served on study committees, including those that did make changes to the retirement system over the years. Following those years at VSEA, I served 6 years as the Vermont Commissioner of Labor from 2011 to 2017. In that capacity, I oversaw workforce development, unemployment compensation, economic and labor market information, and the Workforce Development Board. In that capacity, I worked with almost all of Vermont employers in the employer community in every county across the state. Magnitude of the job loss in the spring of 2020 as a result of COVID has had no precedent since the end of World War II. More than twice the number of jobs were lost during March and April of 2020 than during the Great Recession of 2007 through 9. COVID-related issues, job loss, childcare loss, erratic school schedules, and fear of the continuing virus are keeping current workers out of the labor force today. In addition, economists were already noting the lack of entry into the workforce for young males for many years prior to the COVID collapse, either due to lack of job opportunities, particularly in minority and rural areas, lack of confidence, or overcommitment to non-work activities such as electronic games. Vermont's economic engine of Chittenden County and the Connecticut River area near Dartmouth, and to a lesser degree parts of central Vermont, have skewed Vermont's wage and job numbers higher than what the other counties have experienced. It's been traditionally harder for Vermont's other counties to recruit and retain employees. I am seeing this every day in my job in state government as a labor relations manager. In my current role, I oversee the recruitment and retention of a small state department, approximately 175 employees, with a mix of professionals, attorneys, law enforcement officers, and administrative staff. Since April of 2020, we have seen an average number of turnovers, but a very limited number of applicants in almost all counties. When examining the demographics in the general workforce, we see the difference in the generational variation, from baby boomers to Gen X to millennials to Gen Z. The largest percentage of the workforce in state government falls into the millennial category at this time, and studies show that 92% of that group of employees indicate that money and benefits are their top priority when choosing an employer. While Vermont state government has good wages, we are often less competitive than private employers, except in the area of benefits. And that has been our way to secure employees and talent to the public sector. If the retirement plans are overhauled and redefined to make them less attractive to applicants, I believe that we will not be able to compete as we should for the best and the brightest, nor keep our Vermont children here, nor those who come to school in Vermont for college. Chronic underfunding to the actuarial recommendation has plagued Vermont plans for years. Our public employee unions warned of those adverse consequences as far back as when I was working with VSEA, while employees contributed their share of the funding that was asked of them. I applaud this committee for whatever efforts you are making to thoroughly examine all the factors that created the current fiscal problems, but recognize that the problem was created by the employees. The fact that employees are living longer should not be held against them. Unfortunately, it is clear to me that state employees, troopers, and teachers don't feel that their voices are being adequately heard, and I believe the collaboration in determining whatever changes you need to make is critical in order to avoid the erosion of employee morale and trust. I'm go off script here for a moment to share with you that during my tenure at VSEA, we were seeing very large rises in the health insurance plan. So much so that employees' wages, COLA increases were being immediately eaten up by the premium increases. We spent a 40-day period of time with a mutually chosen consultant who brought 2 actuaries with her, Mary Harrison out of the Midwest, and we worked with them. And over a 40-day period, made structural changes to the healthcare plan that resulted in low single-digit increases to that plan for many years, including, as many state employees here will recall, premium holidays that were occurring sometimes as many as 4 times a year. But that was a very, very deliberate collaborative process where employees, if either management or the employee group seriously objected to a particular change, we moved on until we found enough changes that would bring us the money that we needed to bring that plan into cost containment compliance. So I do urge the collaboration for whatever you're working on to continue. Many long-term employees are talking about leaving state government. I don't think that is a surprise to you at this point. My friends and colleagues are saying that they are watching what changes may be on the horizon and that they are ready to leave if adverse proposals are adopted. The exodus of employees from their positions in every agency, department, and school district will have a devastating effect on Vermont public services. The knowledge, skills, and institutional memory of long-term employees and educators will be lost, as will their crucial role in mentoring and assisting new employees coming into the workforce. The process should not push forward changes to the plans that are unfair to employees who have dutifully and financially contributed as required to the system for many years with the expectation of being able to enjoy the rewards of their dedication and service in many, many difficult roles and situations in state government and in the teacher community. This crisis, as you know, did not occur overnight. Proposals that do not have stakeholder support should not be adopted. It's critical to identify options with state employees, troopers, and teachers at the table to find the solutions that do not demoralize and potentially break the trust with public employees. Thank you for allowing me to testify today.
Thank you, Annie. Any questions, comments, responses?
Sure. I'm a state employee. Just from your perspective in state government, what are you seeing in terms of the demographic challenge, demographic factors that might be influencing kind of the retirement situation?
So I think it's on both ends of the spectrum. I think the more senior tenured employees are looking at the proposed, for example, the proposed increase in age, the age component, and many people saying, I don't want to work till age 67. I also think at the younger end, you see employees who are not necessarily as committed to one employer as my parents were, as many of us in this room were, where we came to an employer and we're glad to be there for 30 years or longer. So I think, it's a shift in both attitude towards employment. It's also at the younger end of the spectrum, but I also think it's a shift at the older employees who are saying, at this point, I'm tired. I would like to be able to do something else besides work and enjoy some retirement years. I don't know that that's necessarily anything more than just an observation, but I do interact all day long with 175 of our employees in my department, and I ask them how they feel about things. How are they looking at what's happening with the pension discussions? a good friend of mine, left DCF, a very talented manager in DCF left because she was so concerned about what was the potential changes to the plan. She was fully vested, but a young employee, like a mid 50s. Another very good friend of mine is an engineer with state government and is fully vested, could go, and said to me just last weekend, I'm waiting to see what happens with the pension plan, but I will go if I think things are going in the wrong direction. That employee probably was planning on working 7 more years for state government. But as an engineer, she has other options and she's fully vested. What we don't want to see happen is people who are really important to the public service delivery system in this state leave state government because they don't know what's happening or they're fearful of what's happening. And I think to the extent that this committee can find the best balance possible to address the fiscal issue of the plans, which I know that is what your main goal is, but I also believe too that don't lose sight of the fact that we may lose some very important and critical body of knowledge, institutional knowledge and skill set if people feel that these changes are untenable.
Hi, Andrew, I'm a kindergarten teacher from Waterbury. Thanks for coming today.
Thank
One of our charges through Act 75 is to explore how any structural benefit changes impact women specifically in the workforce, and knowing that the majority of people receiving a pension from these 2 systems or 3 systems are female. Do you have any insight or thoughts on how that might impact the female workforce with recruitment and retention?
I think we're having that issue. Thank you. I think that's a very good point. State government, the split of women to men in state government is pretty much equal, but I know in terms of the education community, it's predominantly women. In Vermont, state government, at least our issue right now is keeping women in the workforce as a result of some of the challenges that they're facing with childcare, lack of childcare. I mentioned erratic school schedules, kids are in, they're out, they're in, they're out. And I think most people, probably everybody in this room had hoped that by this point where we are today in August of 2021, that we'd be further past this virus crisis, but we're not. Our issue right now is trying to be as creative and flexible with our employees who can potentially work remotely, telework, and Suzanne, Secretary of Administration Suzanne Young, has been very supportive of asking the agencies to look at that. To a large extent, it is, as you can imagine, in my view, is a woman's issue because they generally have the bulk of the obligation for childcare and elder care too, often. So I think that we're lucky that we have a leadership in state government that is indicating telework, think how you can make this work for people. And so I think that's true. I think in the education community, when teachers and paraprofessionals and school support staff have to be in the building, you're going to face some of the exact same challenges we are. You're going to have a more difficult time in terms of retaining employees, I believe, not necessarily because they don't love what they're doing, but they are faced with so many challenges right now with the collapse of childcare openings and all of that. So it is, these recruitment and retention problems in Vermont are difficult anyway. I was looking, if you've not looked at the Department of Human Resources workforce reports, they're fascinating. They really are. They capture so much incredibly good information. And I went back and I started reading from, I took randomly the other night, I took like 7 reports going back to 1996, 1999, 2001. I started reading through trying to get a sense of what we were looking at for changes. And there are times when the turnover in state government is as high as 12%. But that's, and then I looked at where that placed us in regard to other New England states, because that's the comparative model that is provided in those reports. And for the most part, except for some years, we have lined up very closely to our turnover rate with other states, percentage-wise. But there have been some troubling years in Vermont in terms of recruitment and retention. And when DHR took a look at that, they were looking at, to a large extent, the lack of applicant pool. And that's what, in terms of the recruitment issues, that concerns me a lot in terms of Vermont lack of applicant pool. I saw a statistic, I think that said there were 4.1 applicants right now. Frankly, from some postings we just did, we just posted an IT position, pay grade 22, which is, Eric knows because he's in the state government. It's the pay grades go up to pay grade 30. So 22 is a pretty good range. You're getting into a good salary and we have benefits. 2 applicants. It was posted widely for like 20 days, 2 applicants. And, that's not uncommon. Attorneys in our non-Chittenden County area, sometimes 2 applicants, Bennington, Wyndham, 2 applicants, Caledonia. So it's challenging to get people to apply, and that will be our problem. And we have to really dig into getting, as you've heard the governor say, getting more people to Vermont, getting more people into the workforce, and being the best. Public sector needs to be able to compete as an employer. And I think everybody here who works in government agrees with that we would be really in tough shape if we can't have a good ability to recruit for ourselves.
So I just have a question about the balance between, we talk about retention and recruitment kind of together, but they're, and I'm not sure that this is true, but the way I see it is that they might be a little bit different in terms of what you were talking about. People now who are applying for jobs are not necessarily thinking about staying for 30 years. You have the issue of people who've been here for a while, who are vested and are thinking about their retirement and about staying. And then you have the issue of people who are trying to recruit who might not be thinking that. I know I just talked to a couple of people last weekend who had applied for state jobs, and the salaries were less, the health benefits were pretty comparable to other places, and the retirement benefit was clearly, and they both said, I don't need to think about retirement now. I'm 27 and 32 years old. I need the money right now. So how do we create a system that balances that with the people that are already there so that nobody bears the brunt?
Well, let me first say that one of the things we do when we are meeting with candidates and interviewing people and we talk a salary, generally a salary, we always show what the benefit structure is in terms of the percentage of your salary, and people are often amazed. And I have this opportunity of kind of looking like the old grandmother type, which I am. And I can say to them, listen, you're young. And I've done this with, I think BGS should actually probably give me some sort of an award or plaque, because I'm talking to the younger employees, telling them, listen, there's a lot of opportunity in state government, and you're young now because a lot of the kids that are coming through for their maintenance and custodian positions are younger. And I say to them, listen, somebody else might think it looks good. Somebody else is, offering $2 an hour more. But let me remind you about your benefit structure. And I tell them all about it. And we do the same thing when we are interviewing people and we're looking at trying to make sure that we've caught somebody's attention. And we talk a lot about those benefits. And I think that has made a difference. I think I've actually, as I said, I think I've convinced a couple of kids to stay with BGS. And I know that I've convinced a couple of younger employees to come to us. And I've said, you know what, when I came to state government, when I was talking, in the labor position, I said, I was talking to younger employees. I used to go down and we would have those conversations about what's working, what's not working, and money is not necessarily always the driver for people. And I think that we've learned a lot through probably the only big bright spot of the pandemic is that we've learned that telework can work and we should trust our employees. I fought for so many years to get the state of Vermont to adopt a telework policy. Going back many, many, many years. I've been out of VSEA for 12 years, and I'm going to say it was probably 25 years ago. I was knocking on DHR's door and showing them the policy I had written, and they were like, no. And some of that was just like, oh, what if they fall and trip? I could fall and trip in the office too. It was always one thing or another, but it is the one bright spot of what we learned. Motivating employees in terms of getting them to come in, money, communications. This is a generation of kids, I say kids, people, young adults who, want they want to communicate and they want answers. They're so used to flipping up a phone and getting an answer to whatever they're asking, whether it's a restaurant review or anything they want that immediate answer. And when they send an email and there's non-responsive, it's not responded to, they're just like, I think they're shocked, So we've had to talk with our managers and supervisors about responding to people. Do not walk away at the end of the day. I don't care if it's 4:30. If you've got emails from your staff that you haven't responded to, please answer your staff. Please make sure you're responding. This is a generation of young workers who crave that. And they also crave their downtime, some of their personal time. Thank God that there's a little bit more perspective on work-life balance. I think we're all learning that, but I think younger employees are very concerned about that. But again, I think given some of what we're looking at, money is a driver, and it is allegedly the driver for millennial. Now, I wonder, that report was done a year or so ago, so I wonder if it would be different today, post-COVID, if people's perspective has changed. It might be, but student loan debt is a real thing, and professional loan debt is a real thing for people going to law school and medical school and stuff like that. We have to make people be able to afford to work in Vermont.
You mentioned getting people to Vermont, and that's another silver lining in this. Telework has expanded in a lot of places, and it's opened the doors for people to come work and live here. At the same time, I think people are going to be more drawn if they have quality school systems, good teachers, and a well-functioning government. Do you have any thoughts on how the provision of critical public services are aided by the packages?
You look at employers' statistics of how much it costs them to train employees, and when employees leave shortly after they're employed, like what it costs. And there was actually a stat in one of the workforce reports of DHR that talked about that. And in positions like trooper positions, for example, when they're sending people off to the academy for weeks and weeks, and if they don't stay, the cost of all of that. So I think that we want to balance. We need to balance. We need to get people into the system and into Vermont. Telework's a great option for us, and I think we're going to see an expansion of that. I also think that we have opportunities, and I want to remind folks here who are in the legislature and policymakers that, if people are coming in to Vermont and they are, for example, English as a second language, if they fall within any of the categories of the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act administered by the Vermont Department of Labor through the U.S. Department of Labor funding, that immigrants, for example, automatically qualify for workforce training at no cost to the community or to the state. They're going to be able to be eligible for that WIOA funding for workforce training. What can we do creatively? We can actually take a look to see, how do we support new people coming to Vermont and refugee communities and all those folks, because there's lots and lots of money that comes into Vermont from the U.S. Department of Labor for workforce development and training. And it's just a matter whether it's apprenticeship or specific work classes. It's all there. And I think that we need to look at utilizing that money in a better way. And I don't think that that answered your question, but
No, that's hopeful though, because just our larger demographic challenges can go a long way to, putting the funding of the pension system on a more sustainable path. So that would be very helpful.
Okay. Thank you. Okay. So I thank the committee for the work that you're doing, and I know what you're doing is a challenge, and lots and lots of of stresses on all of you individually, from the work that you have to do to try to figure this problem out. And I do think that I applaud. I've been, as I said, on some of these types of committees over the years. I remember sitting with Bob Greenmore and Jane Woodruff and lots of people in this room for a long time working on retirement overstructure, overhaul. So I know it's not easy. I applaud the work that you're doing. And I just offer the perspective of collaboration and engagement is really important, and trust among your community is really important here too. So thank you for the opportunity to share a few words on behalf of Vermont Labor.
Thank you. And I will say that I'm sorry that Leona Watt, who is a state employee with the Department of Corrections in Springfield, was not able to be here today to hear your testimony.
Thank you. And do look at the State Department of Human Resource Workforce reports. They're fascinating. They're a tremendous wealth of information. Thank you.
Thank you, Eddie.
Thank you.
Okay. Are we at 2 o'clock?
We are at 2:30.
2:30. So we're going to move to the next segment of our agenda here, which is continuing our brainstorming activity. And being slightly reluctant to say anything after my very inarticulate outburst this morning or this afternoon at the auditor, which I apologize again. I, however, am going to say this, that over the past week, I've been hearing a lot of comments from different people, and I think that they're important to share. It's just really a couple comments, and some of you may be hearing similar comments, so I'm going to take a chance and share them with you. First, I should say that I haven't heard these comments here necessarily, but from those who watch and those who talk to those who watch these. And we may not want to hear this, and perhaps it might be better if I didn't even share, but after a lot of thought, I have decided that I need to. So it seems like there's a lot of misunderstanding out there, and we need to dispel that. So here goes. From some legislators and those who are not directly impacted by the retirement system, meaning non-teachers and non-state employees, what I'm hearing is this: all they, meaning the NEA, the VSEA, and the VTA members want to talk about and put forward is additional revenue. On the other hand, from teachers and state employees, I'm hearing all they, meaning non-teachers, state employees, and VTA members, want to put forward and talk about is cutting benefits. So that's what I'm hearing from both sides out there. I don't think either of those is true, or I'm hoping it isn't true. We have talked about both. On July 7th and 29th, we talked about increasing revenue, and on August 8th and 14th and 18th, we talked about benefit cuts. But if that is the perception out there, we need to change that perception, because we won't succeed if we don't. So I want to make sure that the 13 of us on this committee do not share that perception that this is all they are talking about and this is all they are willing to talk about. So I want to make sure that we don't share that perception, and that we understand that unless we're willing to consider everything, we won't succeed here, and then we need to get things on the table. So I needed to say that because I've been hearing it out there in the community over the last week or so. So I don't know if anybody else agrees with the perceptions that are out there or not. Or if that's enough of that conversation, it's up to you. Yeah, Eric.
Yeah, I think that sort of all one camp the other camp. That's not my perception. And I would agree that, that everything, everything does need to be on the table. At the same time, I will say, I think, benefit changes do clearly have adverse impacts in terms of recruitment, retention, economic follow through in the economy. So, I mean, I would put those very much last. We heard this morning how West Virginia turned around their system with really looking at the funding side. Mike, you brought up earlier Maine, and it's all I understand that Maine didn't make a huge benefit or didn't really address the benefit side. They looked at some smaller provisions, if I'm correct, but they primarily looked at funding and risk sharing. So, yeah, I think we do need to kind of create a prioritization, or what are we gonna pull from first, and what are we gonna pull from last. But that's my thought.
Yep. So given that, last Thursday, after we left here, I had shared that I had put together a kind of a list of potential changes or options. And I sent an email to everybody, hopefully everybody got it, saying I was going to put together this, I was going to add to it, and ask for people's input. I didn't hear from anybody. I didn't get any emails from anybody about potential changes here. Molly, there was an email from you asking for the actuaries to do something, but I didn't put that on here because, but so this is, as far as I know, plus some stuff that came up this morning, the options have been presented to us so far that have been, and I put them into 3 kind of categories. And this is just a draft, so you can just toss it under the table and we can go in some other direction if we want to, but I put these together so there's I don't know if any of you have copies or not. There are some extra copies around, into kind of general statements, and then increase assets, and then reduce liabilities. So there are those 3 kind of buckets. And I don't know how you want to proceed with that. I would say there might be some on here that everybody says, are you kidding? And we can cross that off, and there might be some.
Put those at the bottom.
Oh, we'll put them at the bottom, yes.
Those are the last.
Yeah, but, and there might be some that nobody wants and some that everybody wants. So I don't know how you would like to proceed here, but I just thought that in my mind anyway, it's easier for me to think about them if there's some orderly fashion. And so that's what I did. And we can do with it what we want. Does anybody have a suggestion about how we proceed? I did add some after this morning, like under the COLA, as if it's simple or compound, increase retirement age when life expectancy increases. Added some of a few details like that came up this morning when people. Peter.
One of the things that we heard this morning was about a layered amortization schedule. So it's not necessarily change the amortization schedule, but it's also looking at a layered amortization schedule approach. And looking at, as David said, 15 years appeared to be optimal on during their presentation. It does not affect the fact that our current amortization schedule is going to be unpayable once we reach the 2030s, but it does address market bumps and other issues that would normally get inputted into that amortization schedule.
I saw one earlier. I don't know what it looked like. It was with the COLAs up that, I forgot what statement, it didn't see it on the sheet, but they paid regular COLA on like the first $60,000 benefits and then changed their COLAs. It kind of went up. is that, and I don't have a tiered system in my mind, but is it something to potentially look at? So like if for 24,000 or 30,000, whatever number that we come up with, we do, you know, say the current COLA, and then after the next 30,000 might be 50% of the COLA, and then the last 30,000 could be like 10% of the, you know, kind of just progressive tier, you know, and I don't know if it's supportive, just seeing what impact that would have on it. Yeah,
Well, I think it's,
well, that one was just a no COLA after a certain amount.
yeah.
So I saw one state, and I thought it was New York, but it wasn't, on one of the slides that they kind of tiered COLA, so the more money you got in retirement, the less of a COLA you got. The other piece that of information, I guess, that I'd like to see, and I guess we haven't seen it, looking at, and it's, I just want to see it as we compare to other states, is what does a retiree, whether it's a teacher or state employee, look like with their average social security benefit as well? Because when we're looking at some of the, you know, what's the full picture of retirement? It's like, you hear 24,000, you go, oh my God, how can anyone survive on that? So then they might be getting another amount of dollars in social security. I guess, what's that whole picture look like, and how much does the average state employee now and state teacher, how does their kind of income break down between social security and their pension? Just so that we, as we're starting to think about these decisions and think about the people, what's the bigger picture that, you know, they're what other sources are they pulling from? You know, so when we say we're impacting a COLA a little bit, they still are getting a social security COLA. So, you know, average, you know, say it's 50-50 their income, they still might be on average getting a 4 or 5% increase each year instead of no increase on their income, just weighted differently. So I don't know what those numbers are, but I think they'd help me as we start to calculate this.
So I think that what we'll do is just kind of start going around and around and around and around. And the other thing that I didn't put on here with COLAs that came up this morning was whether they're simple or compounded.
A simple versus compounded. COLA?
On COLAs, that was on one of the presentations from Nazra. Yeah, yeah. And I didn't have that on here because I didn't even think about that at the time. So Michael, do you have any additions or comments or things you'd like to look at?
No, this time.
Okay. Andrew?
I'm still trying to read through it. I haven't
Yeah.
gone through all of it, but I wasn't sure. I think Corey and I both mentioned that idea of possibly being able to opt in for X amount of extra contribution. Is that reflected somewhere on here?
I think that's what I meant by different rates for more generous benefits.
Got it. Okay. Can we add on, because part of my idea was specifically the service credit time, not necessarily a higher increase benefit amount.
Oh, but to pay a more of an amount to buy time.
Yeah.
to,
Does that make
essentially.
sense? So let's,
Does that fall into either increased assets or reduced liabilities?
I don't know if we know until.
Yeah,
the calculations and that.
I'm just gonna add.
Because you could design it so
Would
it
you
increases
create
the
a different
assets.
category for that, or would you say that that fits?
Well,
Yeah.
increase of assets and increases liability. But I think it would be an actuarial reduction. So one is not wrong, but
Or it would be cost neutral.
Say that again.
Currently, it's cost neutral, so in systems, when somebody purchases 25 years of service, the calculation is cost neutral. Meaning it's not going to increase the assets nor it's going to reduce the liabilities. With current.
so if you have that extra money in up front, then you should have a longer time to return. That's why I view it as a win-win. But who knows?
Okay, so
Thank you.
I wrote purchase time for higher contributions.
Yeah.
I think it's already on here, but one thing I noted this morning was the very flexible contribution. I think that would fall under tiered peg, keeping pace with normal costs. And the actuaries have done a lot of work on contribution rates, both for the treasurer and I think for the House previously, but I'm not sure if they've looked at how that would change the picture. So that was something I'm going to put on the table for the actual
To,
look at how a shared flexible contribution rate would affect future ADEX and unfunded liability.
so, how do we want it? Any requests that we make to the actuaries have to go through joint fiscal. So Chris, do you want to join us here? And you can kind of maybe keep track of,
I also think, I mean, just for sort of administrative expedience, I think we're also gonna need some prioritization as.
Right.
What.
Yes.
We will.
We can really narrow down.
we will.
We're gonna need specific. things.
Yeah, but we're gonna start, this is our kind of initial go around. We'll keep narrowing down, I think. I mean, we clearly have to, we can't, yeah. But if you, we just thought that it might be more efficient if you joined us so that you could be kind of keeping track of what. Yeah.
All that increasing assets, probably look at future budget surpluses to go towards the unfunded liability. And generally, I don't have a good answer to this. I'd also like, I really like the win-wins. I know you had to increase, incentivize people to work longer. I don't know if we could do something similar to, if there would be savings in OPEB, if, people worked later, the state picked up a larger share to incentivize people working through that period. That's okay. I don't have any good suggestions except, I think that incentivizing working longer is one, but I'd be interested if other folks had thoughts on some options that might kind of incentivize the behaviors we'd like to see.
So it's on here, but maybe not.
It is, well, the increase, I did see the one that we talked about, I don't.
Yeah.
I don't know if there are others, incentives to work on.
Yeah.
We talked about the 1% idea of possibly not doing something to help contributions go in. I don't know if there are any ideas, other ideas. I like the one.
I think that none of these are really fleshed out at all. They're just, if we decide to go into any one of these, there's going to be a lot of options within them.
Well, I think the hard part is to conceptualize it, to ask for the first numbers, because like Chris said, they're gonna want some specificity, and even like in mine, I don't know, and so it's like you just throw a dart at the dartboard to get a first number and then test it kind of from there, and I don't know how easy that is with the actuaries, because I don't think a lot of us know what a right number is, or we might offer something it's gonna save a ton, and it's gonna save like $12.
Thank you for putting this together too.
You're welcome. I'm not going to comment on anything since I wrote them all down. I do have some things that I think are more important than others, but Sarah?
So I don't know if this falls in the category of exploring a possible option, but maybe back more to what Corey was just saying about wanting to understand the landscape. I feel like it's really important for us not to create any recommendations here that make the problem bigger. You know what I'm saying? So that's why we're doing this exercise, asking for the actuarial analysis. But I feel like I need a little bit more information about early retirement incentives that have been offered in the past by school districts, because in my mind, if we have a dynamic in place in statute in Vermont that allows or encourages school districts to send high salary teachers into the retirement system, but doesn't adequately account for the increase in benefits that will be drawn by that retiree down the road, we really to understand that, and we need to understand and make a decision with eyes wide open of whether those kinds of early retirement incentives should be allowable because they have such a burden, or could, if they are real, could have such a burden on the health of the teacher retirement system. So,
Or pay into the system like he mentioned in a revenue neutral way, whatever that number is. So they still might have a savings on their budget, but the school district, say they give the teacher X amount of dollars to retire early, but then pay the VSERS program, whatever at the time they need to shed that year or two of service. Because you're right, I think the liability just gets put on the state program at the disservice to all the other retirees in the program.
right, and we have to recognize that as our student population has declined, there's necessarily been a decline in our teacher workforce, right? And a lot of that you can see in a lot of the graphs about the retirement system. So, many of these things may have already been done to the system. It's important for us to understand how we account for those early retirement incentives and whether the school district who sees the benefit in their budget line is actually making the retirement fund whole.
Well, I am actually going to add one thing here. I wasn't going to say anything, but there's one on here that I never heard from anybody else, and I just completely made it up. So I should point that out probably when Corey talked about Social Security. There was a recommendation at one point that COLA should only be kick in after a certain number of years, or at 65 or 67 or whatever. My suggestion was we should apply COLA only until Social Security kicks in, and that after Social Security kicks in, you might need the COLA because you now have the Social Security check. So I just completely made that one up, but because we haven't heard it from anyone else, so I just wanted to make sure that.
Do you want to respond to
It
retirement?
it was actually something Corey was saying about the school districts paying, like if you give their incentive and the school district contributes. The school district contributes something now, correct, to new hires? New hires,
Was it $1,000?
Right, the exact number, it's a set dollar amount that's calculated every year. That's correct.
so they pay that just one time for that
No,
first year, or
every
they pay
year.
it their entire life?
That goes to the OPEB trust, that's
Right.
not the pension fund.
But do we know what that amount is? I'm just
I can't
curious.
remember from my head, I'll get it.
I'm sorry, that new teacher charge goes to the teacher OPEB trust, doesn't go to the teacher pension fund.
Yep, let's keep going around the table.
Okay, John. Add your comment.
One thing that's not on here at all is that.
Yes, it isn't.
Not really.
It isn't.
So I mean, I do think we should consider how we keep on those that, what the amortization schedule should look like. I know single round numbers, 3% of payroll amortization schedule for fixed period of time. I think we should look at other amortization around that. That's something that's not on here. I do think we should look at return for contribution. Like some states have already done. And contingent or limited quote.
What was the last thing?
Hmm?
What was the last thing?
Contingent forward?
I'm sorry.
Contingent on the health of the fund.
Yes.
Thank you.
Oh, yeah, that would be automatic tied to health
And
and fund.
just- I did ask if there were any incentives that other states could use. And I don't think there are many states that have figured out incentives. And I would be very supportive of that, because if you look at the defined contribution world, I mean, a lot of behavioral economics that's been helping to design defined contribution plans recently has been on incentivizing people to make the right decisions. And so I think there could be something there.
Unfortunately, I don't know if there's any other states that have gone down that road yet.
Along the lines of incentives, I'm wondering with Chris here if maybe he could explain further. There was a slide last time that said, there was a note at the bottom, I think it was, increasing the AFC cap and isolation increases costs. However, increasing the AFC cap incrementally by less than the benefit multiplier for each year worked beyond the max results in modest savings. Wondering if we could explore that further.
Sure. So the numbers that were included in the slide deck bear that out. If you see that there is one, I don't have it in front of me, but there was one where if you just increase the maximum AFC, I think it was for the teacher system, from 60 to 70% of AFC without making any other changes, that increases the liability of the pension system, because one of the factors that goes into calculating your pension benefit isn't just your longevity, it's your salary history. So, the longer you work, you'll have salary growth that's also going to drive up your benefit. But some of the numbers that were costed out in the January report that were in there is one of the plans, and I forget which one, it might have been for Group C on the state side. They costed out the impact of what would it, if you were to increase the AFC cap by, I think it was 1% for every additional year worked beyond the point where your years of service times multiplier hits you at that cap, that would result in actuarial savings. So the issue is you can't just increase things across the board without tying it to an increase in longevity. That is probably a very convoluted way and very confusing way of trying to answer your question. I don't know if I did or not, but.
It's still sounding like an incentive. An incentive that saves money, gets people to work longer
It is.
and saves money.
It is, as long as you're not increasing the AFC cap without making any other changes. If you just say the cap is now 70% of your AFC instead of 60%, it will likely result in further costs.
Right.
You need to tie the increase.
1% if you work a year longer.
Right, so that is an example of an incentive that would, generally pan out in favor of the actuarial math, yes.
And until someone hits age 65, maybe, and then, or would it continue? This is part of the savings largely in.
No, this is all pension. This is,
Oh.
I mean, there may be savings on the OPEX too, but this is specifically about the pension.
And so that goes in the increased asset part of this chart?
That would be mostly reducing liabilities.
Right. The longer people work, the more their liability to the system. Because they're not
It doesn't move the needle tremendous.
draw.
But it's a small number, right? Isn't that what you?
So it sounds like the actuary has only looked at that for a small group, potentially maybe Group C. Could that be an actuary request? So, but I think 1% is less than a multiplier for all groups. So would that could that be asked to the actuary to quantify the savings associated with such a provision?
Just need to know what you want to model and who you want to model it to.
My suggestion would be 1% for each year.
So a 1%, just for clarity, a 1% increase in the current AFC caps for every additional year worked beyond the point at which they would be sort of maxing out under the status quo.
And then help me understand how the actuary would make a prediction about the behavior of human beings within that system.
That's a
bit of a shot in the dark.
that is a question that is best answered by the actuary, but yeah, I think that is sort of like Alicia with all of this, is it can be difficult to predict individual employees' behaviors. They make reasonable assumptions, but just till you check them against experience, you never know for sure. That's kind of the story of pensions in general.
That's why actuaries get paid so much.
Yes.
Something else?
Well, it also seems like, I think we've heard this from Chris Roop, and then again this morning, that modifying the vesting period doesn't really do anything. So I'm wondering if we could just scratch that off the list. as we move towards condensing your list.
I'm happy to scratch that one off. I mean, it came up, so I put it on here, but you're right, we did hear that.
I'm
I
fine
think
with
I
that.
brought it up, but let's say you take it up.
All right, we did. They said that it makes very, very, very. Well, we've added 5 or 6 things and removed one, so
We're doing well. And we're only almost once around the table and we've been doing this for.
yeah.
I had scratching that off as well, so thank you, Kate. So I guess, I just some thoughts here and trying to think how they work together. So one thing we heard today on the actuarial assumptions, just on the payroll growth, it just got me thinking a little bit about what are all the different actuarial assumptions that go into, developing the ADEC and the amortization schedule and all sort of the unfunded liability calculation. And maybe at some point in the near future, it'd be helpful to have the actuaries come in and just describe those and describe how we've done historically. Because again, that payroll growth one wasn't even what I was thinking about. You think of the investment return assumptions. And, if you're paying the ADEC every year for a long time, but your assumptions are too rosy, you're not fixing the problem, right? The problem is growing and sort of growing and you're not even realizing it. So I guess some discussion about, really getting a sense of what the true problem is. So we know, okay, what's what are more realistic assumptions to make on all of the points, what the real problem is, and then trying to develop maybe in connection with that, a risk sharing, program, but only once you get the assumptions to a place where, they're likely to be hit or they're more true to what, what we expect it to be. And then when we deviate from that, the risk sharing kicks in to try to prevent things from going too far off the rails. I think exploring from this list, exploring, progressive contribution thresholds on the contributions is something that to look at that in combination with progressive COLA thresholds, similar to what Corey talked about, and in combination with, other uses of, or other sources, not other sources of revenue, but the one-time revenue and those type of, commitments that we already have and other commitments that might be able to be made by the legislature. But I'd also equally like to see that money sort of explored toward the pre-funding for OPEB. What would all of that one-time money do to OPEB? What would that mean for what we'd have to commit to funding it on an ongoing basis? Again, just to sort of get a sense of what that would mean. And then is there, is that a reasonable request of some, additional forecasted revenue to make if it's, if it's a smaller amount and we're taking care of some other structural issues. I also wrote down flushing out incentives to get employers to work longer. It strikes me as something that maybe we could have a subcommittee of this task force on. It's very sort of, there seems to be a lot there. It doesn't seem like anyone's developed great answers that we can use as a template. But I think maybe it would be something to be better developed in a small subgroup rather than us trying to discuss them at our meetings. So those are sort of all the sort of reactions I have to the list at the moment.
I guess for me, I'm gonna deviate from this just a little bit. I don't want to start an in-depth discussion about what Doug Hoffman talked about, but I did listening. The first thing he said was he felt it was a multi-year solution, and I think that's important for us to think about. We might not be able to solve it right at this moment, but maybe in 3 years we can get ourselves back to a place where we need to be, and how and maybe again, I don't know what the answer is, but I'm just going to use 3 years as an example. In 3 years, this is where our goal wants to be. So how are we as a committee going to steer us to that goal? That to me was, I'm not sure that that's what he meant by it, but to me, that's kind of what I was like, that it doesn't have to be solved at this moment. Parts of it certainly do, and we have to get ourselves in a direction to solve it, but does it have to all be solved at this moment? That was the first thing. But number two is, again, I'm not going to sit here and say, but I think there is some validity
to what he was speaking of is, you know, I've been here, you know, 18, 19 years, and there's always talk about, you know, how can we locate cost savings in government, state government, and, you know, anything that we can do to eliminate overspending is good, and I think everyone agrees with that. Is there a way that, as a policy, we could say, okay, you know what, every year, we're gonna try to identify some savings in every department, and whatever savings we identify, we can then direct that to paying down something here. Does that make sense? Where it'll sort of incentivize the employees to try to find some savings, knowing that, hey, if I do find some savings, it's gonna go to something worthwhile, which is our pension fund. Just kind of a thought. And he didn't talk about it, but the other thing I, you know, just kind of thought listening to him was, you know, again, this isn't, you know, I don't know who would do this, but are there properties that the state owns that we just don't utilize, and we're just sinking money into them? That maybe it's a possibility of getting rid of some properties that is costing the state money, as opposed to, you know, and just helping, just, you know, just looking outside the box a little bit. Maybe there is some money out there somewhere that we're just not thinking about, in terms of other places that, you know, again, I don't think we're gonna find $400 million worth of properties, but, you know, every little bit helps, that's for sure. And just thinking about things like that. And then the only other question, I guess, and I don't know, Chris, if you can answer this, is with the NASRA presentation, you know, they talked about how the, you know, the 15 to 20 year range for the amortization was kind of like the rosy time. Am I wrong thinking like we're kind of getting to that point in thing where we just had our assumptions get changed because our, you know, our experience was not what we thought it was, but now we're within that kind of that rosy period, and, you know, maybe where we are settling with what we are is kind of just leveling off. Does that make sense with that?
It does make sense. You know, where we are right now in the current amortization period, in both systems, we've essentially treaded water up to this point.
Yep.
And we're getting to that point in the amortization period where between now and 2038, all else being equal, more of our payments will be chipping away toward the balance of the unfunded liability rather than interest.
Okay.
The issue is, if you were to just re-amortize the current liability on an extended schedule, we go back to paying more interest for years until we start chipping away into the principal. You know, I think what they were talking about, which I think is very worthy of this group considering, is this idea of layered amortization, where, okay, we know where we are right now. What do we do to mitigate our risks going forward if something happens? You know, where we have new assumptions, bad market year, does it make sense to add that to the existing or probably on the edge of unmanageable balance that we need to pay off by 2038? Or does it make sense to treat that incremental growth in liability on its own amortization schedule? So the risk assessment that the pension systems did 2 years ago, 2019, made a recommendation that moving forward, if there is additional growth in the unfunded liability, that not to just kick that date from 2038 till, you know, in perpetuity, but carve out that growth and put it on its own amortization schedule. And I don't remember the specific years they were looking at or the time parameters, but I think GASB rules pretty much say you can't kick it out more than 30 years. But this intergenerational equity question, I think, is why NASRA was landing at 15 to 20 year sort of range as a sweet spot, because that way you don't have one generation paying for costs incurred by a completely different generation.
Dan, if I can, under the general heading there, there's the, in 2028 for the ADEC to tie to a percentage, and then anything above that is, and that suggestion actually came from Steve Klein, and I think that
Okay.
is.
All right. So, and just listening to what you're saying, and I'm just looking at, does it make sense, and I don't know if we've come to that, to change the amortization schedule, or is it changing it, or is it changing the way that we calculate it? I guess that's my question.
I think it's both. So, I don't, I'm speaking from my professional judgment, since you asked me the question.
Yes.
I don't speak for anybody
No,
else
I'm
here,
just trying
but
to understand,
I-
are we changing it, or are we just changing the way
I
we
think if you add, if the only change you make is add years beyond 2038, you're essentially kicking the can down the road.
Sure.
And you're gonna pay more in interest costs longer, and it is going to take longer to get to 100%. However, I think that there's sort of a path forward where you keep the framework that's already in place, but say going forward, we treat different losses on a different schedule. So you will still add to payments between now and 2038, but it will add a little bit less to the payments between now and 2038, because you would conceivably be adding a couple more years to pay off that year's debt. So yeah, I think the judgment would look very different if we were in 2033 or 2034 at a very significant market event that caused the funding ratio to, another great recession happening then. I think that would be a very different calculation and decision than where we are right now, because we're so far out from 2038. But there is a very compelling reason to try to manage the volatility in payments that can happen the closer you get to 2038. That could happen from weird things happening in big spikes, because you have fewer years to spread that impact over.
Sure.
So yeah, it's in a vacuum, I don't think it makes a whole lot of sense to just say we're not going to do 2038 anymore and we're going to do something. But I think there's a middle ground and an alternative approach where you could still stay on the track of liquidating most of that unfunded liability, but try to manage the financial risk going forward. That's not something the actuaries are going to really be able to model for us, because we don't know what's going to happen with the unfunded liability in 2033 or 2034. But it could be something that this group may decide to recommend, which would be consistent with the finding in the risk assessment.
Okay.
Instead of remortgaging the home.
Kind of, yeah.
You know, oh, I want to improve a little bit, or I want to do something. I have big in my basement and I can do something. So it's better to respect.
I kind of picture it like a big layer cake where all the cakes are kind of crooked and it's not like straight up. So, every year you're going to be making payments on the different layers of the amortization schedule, just based on what happened from year to year. Thank you.
In that same vein with this concept of layering, is there a way to also infuse a risk and reward sharing on that, just on that new layer, so that if you have an experience of an actuarial loss or gain, that you might tie that to such as Molly's home equity, so maybe I get a second job to pay off my home equity line of credit, and when I'm done paying that off, I can quit my second job, kind of thing. So, could there be a maybe an increase in contribution or a freezing of?
Yeah.
Well,
I mean, I think there's possibilities to do something like that. It kind of goes back to what you all heard from Nazar earlier, where some states, especially on the COLA, looked like they had tied certain things based on the performance of the fund. So if it's not tied directly to retiring a particular amortization schedule, but it's really tied to, like, did the fund hit a certain percentage funding? And I think arguably that is a more meaningful impact, and a more meaningful metric to look at is, once the fund reaches, pick a number, percentage, then maybe the sort of shared reward part of the share kicks in. And there could be what they were talking about South Dakota does, I thought was really interesting, how they tied the COLA to maintaining, having to make sure that the funds are sufficient to hit some funded. I'm not sure maintaining 100% funded is realistic anytime soon, but it might be interesting to see if something like that can be tied to 85 or 80 or something like that, where, you know, a limit is put on COLAs in the near term until the fund hits some metric of health like that. And then they kick in, provided that they don't drop, provided that they aren't responsible for the fund dropping below that threshold. There are possibilities there. I wouldn't tie it to one amortization schedule. I'd tie it to the health of the whole fund.
Yeah. I think I'd like to explore that.
So one of the things I was wondering when I looked at this, Jeanette, on your second one in the increase that where it says ongoing infusion, is that where things fit in like revenue sources that we brainstormed?
Well, I put two different things there, one-time infusion and then an ongoing infusion, like do we need to put so much money in every single year into this? And I didn't pretend to try and identify the sources at all, because that's something that I don't want to do, but other people can do that. But so the question there is, even if we did that, is it split? Does it go to where does it go? How does it get divided? But that's what that means, yeah.
Can we add in, I know you don't like it, but can we add in the possibility of designated funds into this? Like,
We can make suggestions, I think, for them, but we can't designate funds.
I think Andrew gave a couple for the actors to look at a couple of meetings ago, right?
So the dollar amounts,
That was the dollar amount.
Right.
And-
Oh,
Wasn't the source. It was just the.
okay.
the dollar amounts, but thinking about the presentations we heard from Graham Campbell, were kind of where those dollar amounts came from, thinking about cannabis gambling, the capital
Yeah,
gains
that's what I was thinking.
exemption.
Okay, so that's just a question. Another thing I was wondering, is also going back a couple of meetings, Michael Clausen, I know you made reference, maybe 2 or 3 meetings ago to something coming down the pipe with healthcare benefit reform in that sort of 60 to 65-year-old area, and I was wondering if that might get reflected on here. Or
Sure.
If you could say more to.
Yeah, so we sent out a mailing to all the teachers, retired teachers. We're going to be moving to a Medicare Advantage health insurance plan for retired teachers starting January 1st of 2022. So there will be some significant financial savings to both the state as well as to the retirees. But because that's not being implemented until January of this upcoming year, the full impact of that in terms of what that's going to mean for out year OPEB costs or liabilities, we won't fully know that until the actuaries want to project those numbers. So it's a little too early to tell what the actual long-term impact of that is. But it's going to be in terms of the savings to the retiree and to the state in the neighborhood of about 30% of what's currently being. Correct. In terms of the premium rates that are being paid by both the state and.
So that makes it in, John, I know you had said you wanted to look at the OPEB piece, and with that, like keeping that in mind as we do that will be important. This 22 is not very far away. Did you want to say something about pipeline?
Yeah, I was just wondering what 30% equates to in a dollar amount.
I don't know off the top of my head, but it's probably.
Okay.
This is good.
Okay.
Significant. Okay.
It's a good.
That's a relative term. But okay, great. And the other thing, Dan already addressed, I was pretty taken by the conversation here right after lunch, just about saving possibilities, and I know that we can't use it specifically necessarily, but I think we might be able to, I don't mean to say it, you already did, to kind of create something in our report that that concept.
I'm intrigued a little bit by that too, because I mean, I work for municipality, nothing bad there, but you know, you watch the end of the fiscal year and people spend close to their budget, even if they don't go over, because they go, oh, if I spend too far under my budget, I'm not going to lose budget next year when they do budget again. So is there an incentive? I don't know how it's set up, because you also don't want people to be like, oh, we're not buying a new cruiser we need because we want to fund our pensions. But is there, I don't know if we have time to design it, but I think while I think it's hard to say, we're gonna save 1% across the board in any department, just like I think it'd be hard to go back to school districts and say save 2%. I think it'd be interesting to see if we can create incentives to do that. And that takes longer thought, but I'm intrigued by that. I think that's, getting people on the ground people on the ground are always going to see cost inefficiencies differently than legislators are going to see it. We hear from your managers who say, we don't have enough money for anything. And you might say, well, it's because they spent too much money on this. And so it's an interesting concept to me. I just don't know how we do it. So I'm intrigued, about exploring that further in some capacity.
I think Eric had a really well taken, sorry, that the boots on the ground see it, just like a little example. I don't take classes for credit because it's not going to increase me on the salary scale, and I know I can save my school district $500 or $800 for every course I take by not doing credit. So I don't want to waste their money, so I don't do it. What if we created things that were policy or that help people see that kind of savings to the system as a whole? Now, personally, I'd love to see that saving go toward, oh my gosh, I've lost the word. Where's my young brain, Andrew?
Trying to
Sabbatical, thank you, Andrew. Deemed it to me, but, towards the sabbatical part of our cause of our conduct, but whatever, I think there are ways to train people to look for, just careful.
Not the challenge is in how do you take that $500 or $800 that you didn't spend on a graduate credit and put it in the pension bucket, because your school district is going to say, oh, super,
Yeah.
we didn't have to pay that.
And that's the challenge.
That's the
that we
challenge.
wrap our head around, but
Yeah.
conceptually, I don't mind the idea.
Round again. Round again. Mike?
Just to follow up on the earlier conversation with respect to the new teacher assessment. Current assessment for FY22 is $1,340 per week. And FY21, we're anticipating collecting just under $5 million. So, quite a thing. Chris, if that goes into teacher healthcare.
And was that created to, incentivize people staying long? Incentivize school districts not doing what Sarah did, right?
It was specific to put money into the teacher healthcare.
Oh, okay, it's just for that, okay.
And one other comment just about the ideas here in terms of, this maybe goes without saying, but I'll say it anyway. The degree to which the requests for the actuary to do analysis, I would suggest that we'll come up with that list, maybe look at it again in the context of, is it similar to the modifying the vesting period, which we just discussed, and chair to take off, not have the actuary have time working on things that are not likely to pass, or result in recommendation from this committee anyway. Really target and be specific about what they're going to be working on. Number one, because they have limited time, we have limited time, and limited resources.
And I don't know if this is true or not, but I believe that some of these things have already been
Correct.
looked at by the actuaries that were in either the treasurer's report or the House report. I mean, that the actuaries looked at them, so we can.
And it would all, if I could just add on to what Michael's excellent point is, if there's more than one option or lever that the group would like, that the group feels is worth considering and studying, we should try to get those studied together to the greatest extent possible, because we can learn some things, orders of magnitude and things like that by looking at options costed out on an individual basis. That doesn't necessarily tell us accurately what's likely to happen when options are combined together. So, if there's a menu of options that you're interested in looking at, within to some consistent cohort of members. So for example, carving out people within X years of normal retirement, or, this group, but not that group, getting it all packaged together to send them at once is gonna be so much easier and much more helpful than having a whole lot of back and forth about, well, what if we made this one a 1.5 or things like that? Because we're gonna run against the realities of time constraints and fiscal reality too, because the actuaries are very thorough, but they are inexpensive.
I have a question. So, and probably a lot of left field, but we've talked a lot about surplus funds with state dollars. What happens with surpluses in school districts as part of the ed fund? So the ed fund's bigger than the general fund. And we talk about that and that being a contribution to, the pension system. Are we looking at what do we do with, I just don't know what happens there, because to me, that's another layer of money that seems to be always so siloed from us in the legislature because school districts do their thing with it. And I know, I think my school district throws into a capital reserve fund if they have anything, so they get to keep it for a while. But is there a way to some of that to pay for some of these catching up on pensions? Because it still is public taxpayer broader state dollars. But to me, when we look at general fund surpluses, we're missing a whole other big piece of state government when there might be a surplus in the ed fund. I don't know what they tend to be. I've never gotten a report. Is there a surplus or not in the ed fund at the end of the year? But it's just interesting to me that that could be a potential for more assets to add in without touching liabilities. So
You would want to talk to my colleague Mark about the ed fund. I do just want to raise the sort of question of would the potential of losing any surplus discourage the formation of a surplus to occur?
well, I would hope the teachers and teachers unions and all that within their districts would say, whoa, this is help. This is us, so we're not losing our benefits, and we're not. If we're spending our dollars wisely, we're reinvesting this back. I see it as we're not losing the money. You're actually investing it back into your teachers, keep their benefits as close to whole as possible. So I think there is that possibility for sure, but I would hope that teachers would see that as a benefit to them and still the public education system if we invested some of those if there are any, I don't know if there are, some of percentage of those excess dollars into just the Easter's program. It helps. That one's in a bigger hole than the state of one, so it might help fund that. I don't know what that looks like.
It could be a percentage, so it doesn't just.
Yeah, it's not all of it. It just could be like 40%.
But can I have the process thinking about ed fund money, when the money goes out of the school districts, surpluses don't go back to the ed fund, in school districts?
I think they do.
Okay, so you're talking about finding a mechanism.
It's a mechanism that each school district has to file a report with their surplus and pay a percentage of that surplus into the fund. I mean,
Yeah, so I think in our district this past year, we had a surplus and the school board then I believe voted on what to do with that surplus. I think there's a chunk of it that was set for a rainy day fund. So I think the school board ends up deciding.
but it just might be interesting if we put something in that, even a small percentage of it, 25% or 30%, let the school district still be rewarded for being efficient with dollars. But that might be, because it's a $1.8 billion fund. When we talk 1 or 2%, if there is that out there, and you're talking, when the auditor was talking $5 million and $500 million, you're talking 18 to $36 million that potentially could be put in, which might help preserve the benefit, in the piece. I just think that it just came to my mind when we were looking at cost savings. How do we potentially capture those?
Question on that, there is a surplus in the fund itself, right? I mean, I don't purport to know a lot about that, but isn't there?
Yes. But at the end of FY21, there's a positive fund balance.
It's choppy because of right now we have a surplus because of the tax, like in a year it's choppy. So
$66 million in there now. There's also $14 million set aside for that based on what we do.
And that's largely attributable to stronger than anticipated sales tax and purchase and use tax collections. With all the federal money flowing through the economy. People are buying stuff. People are fixing their homes. People are buying new and used cars. So we've seen collections for both of those revenues go way up.
I see another question about this. That $14 million, is that intended to be a one-time get the ball rolling thing?
Correct.
Or we think we could find this annually? One time.
It's a one-time. So in the spirit of starting it around again, a couple things. Number one, I like your idea, Jeanette, and I think we need to have it costed by the actuaries regarding COLAs until they reach Social Security retirement age. But there was a couple of other options put forth by the previous joint fiscal officer for the state of Vermont that I'd like to add into that as well, which is the cap it at 2% with a incentive, or maybe a better way to look at it would be to allow employees to buy more COLA by having a lower base to base it on. And that's really where he was going when he said cap it at 2%. So I think that would be an interesting thing to pay where it was. One of so thank you, Jeanette. I think that was a suggestion. I just want to keep one thing on everyone's mind here. So I'm looking at the 2020 budget just so that everyone knows. For a person involves four pieces. One, their normal pay, and then their annual benefits, whatever they get. And and certainly on both sides of the coin, everything is covered by the employer. But then you have post-employment benefits. In other words, that retiree who was hired in this case by the school to be able to work a career in the school is now entitled to post-employment benefits, healthcare. Up until I think it was this year and not last year's. This year, the 22 budget, I don't think we did it in 21. Those costs for school employees were covered by not by the schools, not by the ed fund. This year, we actually embedded them into just the ed fund, not required to go to the schools. I'm talking about item number 4 or 5 here under general, last one under general. So the $32 million, I'm probably wrong, uptick in the normal cost that got embedded into the ed fund was comprised of the actual cost of the OPEB that that school employees have as part of their work, but that the state was covering all along. And the other piece then is the pension cost. Now the pension cost for folks in 2020 out of the general fund was $113,466,000. That's out of the general fund. And that is a cost of the teacher's work that is coming out of the general fund instead of coming out of the education fund and school budgets. So as a piece of that 32 million was the normal cost for teachers' retirement as well. So now what you have in the ed fund is the cost of the teacher working, plus the cost of the teacher's healthcare working, plus the cost of the retired teacher's OPEB, just what it would be normally, just because they were here, you know, Chris Root was here 1 year, he's retired, and so we got to pay for him as a retiree, and then his retired pension. So those are now 4 pieces that for this year, I think this was the first year we did it. I don't remember doing it before in 21. So this is the first year that the ed fund is being required to pick up all the costs of an actual worker working in the schools. The first year. As I said, it added about $1 million. The rest of that sentence is going to be a much harder nut to crack it. And depending upon who you're talking to, we could have a heck of an argument, which is and I just want to explain it so that everyone understood. I think those 4 things must go to the ed fund because the schools should be responsible for the cost of hiring. Mr. Schmidt laughed. Somebody just laughed. But that was the guy that I always used when I wanted to illustrate a particular role. So Mr. Schmidt. Anyway, schools must be responsible for the overhead costs. Now, what about the unfunded liability? That's where the other part was, and he didn't mean when he made the recommendation, and I understood this, he didn't mean to say all the unfunded liability for the schools. He said growth of it. from right now until whenever that growth would be responsible. And I'm not prepared to talk about whether that's a good idea or not. I like the first part that I talked to, and I think that should be done. Now, should that actually go to a school's budget? That's going to be the discussion the legislature this year, whether they should actually have that as part of their budget presentation, or whether we should leave it above budget presentation, but still in it. Because and just one of the things, again, I just want to remind everyone here, we put a lot of one-time money into the pension obligation this year, not the normal, not the ongoing costs. We cover that as we normally have in the past. I'm talking the unfunded liability. That increase in unfunded liability due to the experience rating, we could not cover out of ongoing money. We just did not have the ongoing money. So we used one-time money. The problem is that experience rating is going to we were going like this and it parabolic up to here, and it's going to continue on that at that level. So where do we get that additional funds that this year we found one-time money for? I don't know. It was a lot of money. It was close to $100 million. And I don't know where that funding is going to come from in the future. $100 million is not a drop in the bucket. And it is roughly 1/16 of the general fund. So, thank you.
Eric has that question.
Just thinking about how the obligations align with future future general fund levels. The budget did shift up, as you know. There was that shock, but then fortunately we had another shock where the base did go up by 200 million, right? And that's going to be sustained.
So that's a one-time increase to this.
One-time increase that persists.
Well, they're saying about somewhere around
Grows,
60% of it may persist. Yes, 60% may persist.
I gotta say, I might have to try to draw a fine line there. I think what I heard Steve say when he testified here was maybe you could use 60% of it for ongoing expenses, but certainly in the general fund projections going out, it does persist and grow just at a more normal level.
So again, as Steve said, you know, that you might be able to use that, sure, it may persist, same thing, same words. Until it actually materializes, you can't count on it. That's the reason why we have an e-board meeting twice a year, because then they say, yes, it's going to materialize. And now
And if I could just jump into Representative Fagan's point, if you look at the compound annual growth rate, starting in FY22 with what they project the general fund taxes bring in, and you look out to 26, that compound annual growth rate over those years is less than the rate of growth that's projected in the pension costs when all assumptions are met moving forward. So those costs are projected to increase by roughly 3%, slightly more on the state side because payroll is projected to grow higher there. The revenues are projected to grow 2% and change. I think it's roughly 2.5%. So that doesn't sound like a lot, but that translates into many millions of dollars over time. And if you go 1 year further back, look at FY21, before we saw the really big increase that Representative Fagan was talking about, the pension costs will have increased by 2026 by over 60% compared to FY21 levels, and our revenue growth will not be anywhere close to that. So that's where the spirit discussion around whether to use the word unsustainable or not at the last meeting kind of gets back to the fact that your cost line is growing this fast, and your revenue line is growing this fast.
And then certainly it goes to priorities in this bill, because there are 180 different priorities depending upon who you talk to.
Oh, I have at least 3.
I have 10, so.
So
Corey.
I guess keep the table of possible options. I'd like to see the actuaries model out, and I'm just doing it, this is what I'm doing, we're doing in my pension thing with Beamers is my contribution goes up a 1/4 point a year. So what happens, you know, if every July 1 contribution goes up a 1/4 point, teachers and employees, I don't know, for 5 or 10 years, or to a
until
max
now.
of like 9%, 10%. And I know those numbers seem high, but I think just asking the actuary to get a range of it, but we might say, you know, a quarter point this year may not seem like a lot, but as you add it over time, you don't notice it much in your paycheck, especially if you get your raise right about the same time. You still take home more, but you're contributing more. And so, could we get it modeled out, you know, like, necessarily doesn't have to be a quarter point, but what Emer's is doing. What an increased contribution from, you know, when we're getting these options on the table. I'd just like to see what that looks like modeled out.
That's very similar to an idea of DC plans, which is auto escalation, which is every time you get a pay raise, your contribution goes up. And so you don't see it, you don't feel it. So I like that idea.
Well, and I think it gets to like a multi-year solution. Like, we're not jumping it in 1 year and hitting the egg in the face with it, but like, yeah, over the next few years, it's gonna creep up a little bit. But again, I'm trying to balance, as I've been wrapping my head around this the last few months. How do we balance the asking people to pay more, who to pay more, and protecting benefits? And what I hear from state employees and especially ones closer to retirement, who I represent, they'll whisper in my ear, "I'll pay a little more, don't touch my benefits." So it's like, what does that look like? And is there a fair way to at least put that on the table?
No, at least, and this is just my personal opinion, you know, it just goes back to, I've been asked to pay a certain amount. And if that amount isn't enough, then I want it to be enough. Like, you know, again, if we can come up with, I'm just gonna use an example, 10.75%. That's the amount is good, and it's tied to this, and over the next several years, that's the place we're gonna get. Like you said, I think people are gonna be like, okay, you know, in my opinion, that's where I would be. Okay, it makes sense. I understand that, and I'm good with that. That type of thing.
And then if it's done right, I just think like a July 1st, right? I don't know, pay increase tend to go. You get pay increase, you still, the check you look at is bigger, but you did contribute more to your retirement. So it's not, you're getting hurting the employee as much as 10.75 tomorrow or.
Yeah, exactly.
Tomorrow.
Yeah.
Incremental pieces.
Thinking about sort of our constituencies on that, I think the state employees would be supportive of that, especially if it's in concert with additional, you know, whether it's dedicated revenue or, you know, additional other money making it into the fund and paying down the funded liability. I think that would feel like a joint effort, and I think there's maybe buy-in or something like that.
Want to set up, because that model, I don't know what that model looks like and how much it adds, but at least it'll be something for us to discuss when the actuaries come back with it.
Yeah, I think the more specific we get on what you want to model and for who the better.
I would do quarter point, honestly, a year up to, I mean, even to get, if you're at 6% now, to get to 10% would take 4 times, it takes 16 years to get there. So I would model it to that. We may not agree to that at this point, but, you know, and it might be something that goes away once we get to 100% funding, but I would model a quarter point a year up to, I mean, I 0.75 now, I know I'm throwing that out a lot, but that's what I pay as a VMers member, like, you know, what's it look like up to 10, and we may not go there, may only go to 7 or 8, but I think at least I don't want to ask for it and then go back and ask for what does it look like if we go higher. This is just to get the information.
No, I think it would make sense to ask them to model a whole range of whatever the group wants to do around employee contribution rates. I could tell you that just based on analysis that has been done in the magnitude. So employee contribution rate increases are not going to reduce your unfunded liability. They're going to reduce the ADAC costs because you're basically having employees pay a larger share of the normal cost of their future benefits. So like every dollar that's coming out of an employee's paycheck, I mean, on all else is equal is a dollar that's not coming out of the budget to pay for those same expenses. I don't have these numbers right in front of me, but they're in one of my slides I handed out, and they were in the valuations, but you can get a rough estimate of what the total covered payroll is expected to be. For VSERS, the total covered payroll across all groups is in the ballpark of about $600 million. On the teacher side, it's in the ballpark of about $700 million. So, you know, you can do some math about what a quarter point on that is. And the projections are that the state payroll would grow at 3.5% a year, teacher at 3% a year. So for some back of the envelope calculations, you know, for every quarter of a point that goes up, it's low single digits of additional revenue coming into each system.
Right, but you accumulate that. I'm a big fan of, you put pennies away now, they turn into real dollars in the end. So I think that's the point I'm trying to make. It isn't much for state employees, maybe teachers to be putting in right now, but over 20 years, that added up to money or something. It's my thought. I don't know.
So I want to just,
Can I just make one comment related to what Corey was saying? I think it would be much more palatable if we were looking at increasing making those increases in some sort of a progressive system. So like if you are only making $45,000, maybe you're not going up 0.25%.
I mean, yeah, I think having an actuary, I mean, you might lay out some scenarios, but just lay some out for us to look. And we may decide they're bad, we'll look at them, but I think it's worth looking at.
right, so I think one of the things that we need to do between now and hopefully September 9th, which is our next meeting, is we need to put a little more focus and refinement onto some of these ideas that we're talking about. And I appreciate Kate bringing up the suggestion of having it be progressive in that we recognize that people who are on the lower end of any income spectrum are needing more of their money to cover just their basic human needs. And so I like that. Thank you, Kate, for bringing that up. But I wonder if we might need to shift gears at this point, start talking about our agenda setting for September 9th. And I guess I would want to put this conversation that we're having right now back on the agenda. And I think I would invite any of you who want to do a little bit of work on opening some of these things up and tinkering and maybe, call Chris Root for, for a little direction on where you could triangulate, what the impacts might be on some of these things so that we can come back to this conversation with an idea of more of a focused ask and maybe even put these things into combinations of things that we would want to ask the actuary work on in combination as opposed to individually as we listed that.
I'm a little clear about whether some of the things that we've already discussed have gone to actuaries already. I think incentive and conjunction is good, but like, is that one thing in isolation going to go now? Or are the things that I sent in the email, have they already gone? I'm a little unclear.
We're trying to strategize around like prioritizing everything that the task force itself wants to model.
Yeah.
So right now I've sent 3 requests over. I've sent 3 requests over. One was that the task force as a group conveyed to me, and that was taking a look at the cross-subsidization issue and the revenue issues. So we have put forth some scenarios we want them to model, divvying up those dollars in a couple different ways. So that can inform not only the revenue, the recurring revenue question, but also what do we recommend doing with the $150 million that's currently in reserve question. So those are the things that I've sent over so far. There were 2 revenues. One was recurring, one was one time.
Oh, okay.
And it was the multiple numbers for each of them.
And Sarah, I have a question, because there are a lot of options and we don't have a ton of time, and unfortunately we got to get to prioritizing. Would it make sense for us to prioritize individually and send an email to someone what our top 5 are, and then maybe coalesce and see what maybe the top 10 are as the group? And then we do it, because I think when we all have time to kind of sit and think about what we prioritize, because I mean, at least the way it's shaping to me is I think we get a bite at the apple, but I think there'll be long-term discussions and continue to tinker with things to perfect this, and won't get done this year. But how do we all, if we all had 5 things to address, what would like our group's top 5 things to address this year? What would they be?
So I was going to suggest that I could, we have 2 weeks until our next meeting, and I will take the other comments that were made today, the other suggestions, and add them to this. And then I can send them out, but I'll send them out, and if I miss things or if aren't there, or something else came up, or they're misstated, let me know, and then we'll get a final list of people. And then we can just kind of look at them and say, here's where I would put these in my bottom tier and these in the middle tier and these in something like that. Does that make sense? Okay, I'll try to do that by the end of the week.
So I just also wanted to bring up the committee, what I have said in emails, I refer to the email twice now.
Yeah,
So-
and I thought you sent it to Chris also. I didn't even look.
I thought I did too, but it sounds like you didn't.
Okay.
So I might have only sent it to
Yeah,
Karen.
okay.
It was just a request to look at, as you had noted on your thing last week, look at the combination of the underfunding from 79 to 2006, and then the OPEB costs that have come out of the ADEC payments till 2014.
We have the data on the OPEB. They were in the chart that I distributed at the last meeting. Contribution shortfall, including healthcare. Yeah, it's around 150 million, 155, I think, dollars through 2015.
Was this projected amount?
That was what the former practice of paying for teacher OPEB out of the corpus of the pension fund contributed to the unfunded liability.
Okay.
But I guess my question is, and we can ask the actuary to cost out what impact those have had on the ADEC, but I'm not, since that's happened so far in the past, I'm not sure what insight that gives us toward crafting a solution.
Well, I know.
I don't mean for that to sound snarky or disrespectful.
No, I'm not gonna answer it for you, because I think one of the things I heard last spring really strongly from pretty much everybody was that they felt like they shouldn't be, teachers should feel like they should be paying for things that essentially that money benefited all Vermonters, right, in some other place, including the teachers and state, the teachers, not the employees, because it's really about teachers. And so there was a pretty general feeling like this was something of ours that was taken, and that portion of the liability should not be on us.
I don't think the charge of the task force put that on the group in Act 75 to solve. I think the piece of the unfunded liability that this group was charged with, that was the incremental change from last year to the present from the changes of assumptions.
It goes back to the draft that we've been working on, the common understanding of the problems. It was the idea I put out that we should look at that to get a clear explanation to people where if any benefit structure changes are occurring, being able to answer the question of what about the underfunding. And that is really important to people. And just telling somebody we're making these changes, but not being able to give them the full scope of why to answer their concerns isn't going to quiet those voices of what about the underfunding. It goes back to providing people with knowledge and answers to their questions and concerns, recognizing that they are really impacted by this, and that feeling of teachers have paid everything that's been asked of them always.
And the intent isn't to be petty, the intent is to be able to communicate. But my intent is to be able to communicate to the constituency to address their concerns. And those were concerns that I heard really strongly. And so if there's one-time funds going toward the ADEC, then that, if we can address the numbers.
So I guess I understand the value of having the ability to quantify that. And I guess I would turn the question around and say, when we look at all of what is contributing to the increase in the ADEC from last year to this, a significant chunk of that is in the performance of the investment and in the actuarial assumptions that were adopted by the retirement boards and by BPIC. And so, I would just, I guess I say this to caution us not to fall back into that, well, we've paid everything we were asked to pay, and therefore this is our problem. And I would say, well, the legislature has paid the ADEC bill that has been presented out of the general fund. So we as taxpayers of Vermont have paid what we were expected to pay. And yet we have a significant chunk of this growing liability that is due to the underperformance of the investments and the failed demographic assumptions, which are not the responsibility of the taxpayers of Vermont or the general fund or the legislature. They're the responsibility of the retirement boards. And so I worry that at some point, if we continue to focus on how do we parse out whose problem is what, we're just going to end up going like this and saying, well, I didn't sit on the retirement board and I didn't assume that, you know, that demographic experience that contributed, you know, like, I think at some point we've got to start figuring out how to jointly solve the problem and not worry too much about how much of the problem is due to who's mistaken decisions, you know what I'm saying?
I do, and I agree, and I think and. So I think that the one piece about the underfunding and the pieces taken out for OPEB, I think that that's a pretty special and unique part. And I agree with you about all those other pieces being factors that are hugely contributing. That's why we're looking at this collectively as both a revenue issue and the possibility of contribution changes and things like that, because it is an everyone issue. But I do think there's something unique about that underfunding and that OPEB piece. I'm sorry, Eric, I jumped in.
No, definitely. I think I would also argue that it's unique. Adjusting the assumptions is part of proper administration of a plan. Underfunding a system is no.
And I think being able to give that clear explanation to people of what impact that actually had is really important. I bring up Sarah saying the part of the teachers have paid their percent, and I'm not bringing that up saying that I'm ignoring the fact that 2007, 100% or even more has been paid. I'm definitely telling all of my fellow teachers that fact very clearly. But when they ask me, what about underfunding? I don't have a clear answer that I can provide to them that I can say, well, this was the impact of it.
So there's one way to say that hadn't been real clear to me at first. And that is that the ADEC payment schedule that we got on in 2009 accounts for all of the underfunding that was done before that date. And I hadn't appreciated that. The problem that we see ourselves in right now is in the change in the health of the system since we got on that payment schedule in 2009. And the fact that our unfunded liability has continued to grow, and our ADEC has ballooned to the point where it's uncomfortable for the general fund to figure out how to meet that. And correct me, please.
I think that was very eloquent.
With all humility, I'm new to this topic. But this was something that I hadn't appreciated until many months into understanding the challenge in front of us.
So the ADECs that have been made since then took into account all that underfunding.
Right, that mortgage payment that we started paying in 2009 was to account for all the sins of the past.
That we hadn't made those mortgage payments.
And the fact that those mortgage payments have been increasing beyond what we can afford as a state is why we're sitting around this table today.
Does that answer your question?
I understand that part there. I think it warrants further discussion, knowing that there's multiple people around the table that are still interested in looking into this further. And I know that we are short on time today and still need to look at the agenda for next week.
I think if this is needed for our team members and our senior plan members to go back and make the case for some of the changes that may come, obviously, I don't know what it looks like, but I'd be supportive of helping figure whatever it is needed. If that's needed to make the case on the changes we may or may not be asking for, which is what I'm doing. You need this information to make the case to your constituents. I understand that, and I'd be supportive of that.
It's about being able to explain to them and be able to clearly articulate and help answer their question. Concern.
Is it a question for the actuary? Okay.
It's not a blame.
No, no, no.
Here say to help people understand these
But Jeanette,
changes.
there's another piece to this that I talked about,
Okay.
but hasn't been mentioned since, which is the state of Vermont has been paying the normal cost for teachers. That would need to be a part of that factor. Is yes, so the state of Vermont from 2015 took from the corpus of the fund, the OPEB costs. That's been rectified. We're now paying the OPEB costs until this current budget, which now the school, the fund is now paying it. So all of that needs to be factored in there. Because it just balance itself out. You were paying for one, we were paying for.
But if
That needs
it
to be
helps
looked at.
explain things to
Yep.
people,
Yep.
so, okay.
I would suggest that we put an hour on our agenda at the beginning of the next meeting to dig into just these questions. Is that okay?
Concur.
Okay.
I would love to get clarity.
Okay,
Parse it all.
Yeah.
Parse out that.
okay. All right, good. All right,
We have Duna and Silo also on September 9th.
great.
Yes.
Can I just add one thing about this list? One of the things I'm going to do is ask Chris to look at it and to make a mark by the things that we already have actuarial information. So that we don't ask for something that we already have that came from before, okay? Okay, thanks. Sorry about that.
So Dan Doonan, the afternoon would be better for him schedule wise. That would be an hour, so that's the need for time. For Paul Silo, still waiting to figure out what time is best, but probably 30 minutes would be fine. The day seemed pretty open.
How long?
Dan Doonan, 1 hour, Paul Silo, 30 minutes or so.
And he was, what time did he prefer?
So Dan Doonan preferred afternoon, if we could make that work in our schedule.
Sure.
2 o'clock perhaps.
All right.
It's a good thing we didn't have Doonan and Noonan on the same day.
Yeah, would have been a doozy.
Yeah. Oh, I don't know. Oh,
All right, so if we come back at 9 o'clock at the beginning of next meeting to explore a little bit more what we were just talking about. That gets us to 10 o'clock, and I'm going to try to build in a break because we didn't build in a break today. Hard for some people. So 10:15, can we take a peek at the cross subsidization report from the actuary? Okay, and I recognizing that that's something that is impacting the state employee system, but it is something that we as a task force wanted to explore.
Could that be distributed as soon as possible? It's like it's in hand, it is.
I haven't seen it. I just heard rumor that it would be ready for September 9th. I don't know what the status of it is.
as soon as it, yeah. we can distribute that.
45 minutes on that?
Maybe not even that much. It's very succinct.
The actuary slides may be a little hard to understand, but this is explanation of- this is pretty easy.
So did you say Paul wanted the morning? Maybe we could put him at 11.
Paul was unclear what time would work
I was
best.
trying to
but
put him at 11.
Let's do him right after.
Oh, okay.
And then, because with the remainder of our morning and the remainder of our afternoon, I think we should spend time on brainstorming what we want to ask of the actuary. And I wonder if we want to perhaps in those time segments break into subgroups to focus in a little bit on some of the actuarial requests that we might want to make, perhaps. Just suggesting that if we do it in a couple of different time blocks from 10:45 to noon, and again from 2:45 till 3:30, and then leave 3:30 for agenda planning.
Sounds good.
Does that sound okay?
So that was
What have I forgot?
3 o'clock for Posila.
2 o'clock for CeeLo.
2 o'clock.
She put
Duna at 1,
Duna
CeeLo
at
at 2, Rach
Got
at
it.
2:30.
Sorry, I just
and
want to
then
make sure.
brainstorming actuaries. Coming back to basically to this discussion.
And will you get that to Mike? Post? Or Gail, whichever.
Anything that I forgot? Other people want to add?
The magic bullet.
I thought you were bringing that.
$1 billion? Jesus, just. Done. Steve.
Okay,
Wow,
Not even
thank
this.
you.
look at that. It's 4 o'clock and we finished agenda planning in like 12 minutes.
Yeah, that was impressive.
Okay.
We're done.